following video is part of my practical TypeScript course. And if you wish to enroll in the full course, please navigate to codingaddict.io. Again, the URL is codingaddict.io, or you can utilize the link provided in the description. And up next, let's discuss objects in TypeScript. In order to do that, I'm going to create a car. And here, I'm going to set up the brand. That one will be equal to a, let's say, Toyota. And also, I'll set up the year. So first, let me set up the string over here. And then let's go with year, and we'll set that one equal to a number. And if we want to set up the type annotation, it might look a little funky, but we want to do it this way. Where again, we go with colon, then we go with curly braces, and then one by one, we set up those properties over here. So I have a brand. Now, what is the type? Well, it's going to be string. Then also, I have a year. And what is that one? Well, that's a number. So again, either if I try to add some property manually here, where I'm setting up the object, or for example, if I do it dynamically by going car dot and then the property value, unless this property is in the type annotation, it's not going to work. I think I'm just going to use the color example. So let's say I'll set up the color and it's going to be equal to blue. Notice right away I have the complaint because the property is not in my type annotation. And the same goes if I go with car and brand. Yeah, I can set it equal to Ford since that's the correct type. But again, if I go with car and color, it's not gonna fly. So TypeScript will immediately complain. Now, if you're looking at it and you're thinking to yourself, well, boy, this is super clunky over here. I have this object and then actually this is going to be my type annotation. Don't worry, this is just essentially the most basic setup, but I wanted to cover it since I wanted you to understand how everything works under the hood. But eventually we will cover something called type aliases, where we'll nicely be able to set up this shape somewhere separately and effectively just reuse the variable. So again, you won't have this clunky code. Most likely you won't use it, but I definitely wanted you to kind of see this type of syntax. So now once I have my first car, well, I can create another one. In this case, it's going to be a car1 since I'm already using the car variable. And then I'm gonna go with a different brand. And also I'll change the year. And I don't think it's necessary for me to repeat all of the steps. Hopefully it's clear. Whatever we set up in this type annotation needs to match what we have in the object. Otherwise, TypeScript is not going to allow us to compile essentially our code. And now let's tie two things together. I want to tie the arrays with the objects. And in the process, we'll also cover how we have read only option with the TypeScript, as well as the optional properties. So first, I want to create three objects. I want to create book, pen, and notebook. And I want to add them to the items array, which by default is going to be, let's say, empty, but we'll set up the types in a second. So first, let's just go with items. I'm not going to place anything inside of it. And then let's create those three variables. So in here, we're looking for a book. It's going to have two things. We're going to go with title. We'll set it equal to book. And we'll also have cost. Okay, we'll set it equal to 20. And then I'll change this one around to pen. Okay. And the cost, I mean, again, totally irrelevant. I'm going to set it equal to 10, I guess. And then I want to go with notebook. But for notebook, I actually want to remove the cost. And like I said, now I want to store all of these three values over here in the items. But here's the kicker though. I do want to make sure that all of them have the same shape. Now, as we're looking at it, we can clearly see that it's not the case with the notebook, but let's imagine that we don't know that. And at this point, we have two options. We can either repeat the same steps like we did for the car. So effectively, I can just set up this type annotation for all three of them, one by one. Or since I have an array, and I can also set up the type for array, I can do it in one place where I have the items. So far we know that we can set up the array to be equal to a string or a number or a boolean, correct? And we also cover the type union. But we can also do something like this, where I can say, yeah, this is going to be an array of objects, and then each object needs to have this particular shape. Now, what is going to be the shape? I'll say title is equal to a string, or I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm placing this in the quotation marks. And then also I want to set up a cost. So we're going to go with cost and we'll set it equal to a number. And now one by one, as I'm adding these items to my array, once I get to a notebook, check it out. Now TypeScript is like, hey, listen, this notebook that you're adding, well, notice it only has the string. It doesn't have the cost. So whatever type you set up over here, well, it doesn't match. So again, super useful where instead of setting them one by one, if we have an array, we can set it in one place because we also can set up types for array. Now, what is the solution? Well, technically we can go back and add cost over here, but we also have this option of adding optional properties. Now, please keep in mind, you can use the same optional property over here as well when you're setting up the type annotation for an object. I'm just doing it here in the array since this is where we're currently working. Hopefully that is clear. And now I don't have the error because when I set up the cost to be optional, well, it could be there or it potentially could be missing, which is the case for a notebook. And what's also really interesting is that with TypeScript, we can set up the properties to be read only. Again, same deal. Of course, we can set it up over here. But in my case, I'm going to do that for the title, where right before I set up my property, I'm going to go with read only. So now if I go with items and I access, let's say the first one here, and if I try to overwrite the value, so dot title is equal to a new book, for example, it's not going to fly. So now TypeScript is immediately complaining that, hey, listen, title is read only, so you cannot change this value over here. So let me comment this one out. This concludes the object fundamentals in TypeScript. And now we can start working on the next challenge. So now let's work on the objects challenge, where we want to set up the bike. We want to set up the laptop. Then we'll create some products and we're going to store it in the array. So let's start with our bike. That will be my object. Let me come up with some kind of values over here. Then we also want to add the year. And now let's set up our type annotation. So we're going to go with colon, then brand will be equal to string. And also we'll have the year and we'll set it equal to a number. That should do it. Now we just want to change it to a laptop. So let me copy this one, change the name, then brand stays, year stays. We're just going to add a different string value. In this case, it's going to be Dell, and we'll also change the year. And now let's see some errors. So if I'm going to go with bike and year and set it equal to old, it's not going to fly. Why? Well, because year is set to be equal to type number. And the same is going to work if I'm going to create a second laptop. So I'm going to go with laptop 2. And it's only going to have a brand. So we're not going to have the year. So if I'm going to set it like this, notice we get our red squiggly, which means that there's some kind of error. And now let's set up those products. So we're gonna go with product one. That one is equal to title. Let's go with shirt. And let's set up the price. That one will be equal to a 20. Then let's copy and paste. We're gonna go with 2. This one will be equal to a pants one. Why not? Pants are awesome. Now we don't want the price, so we will need to set this one up as optional. And let's create the product array. Let's right away set up our type. By the way, this was supposed to be square brackets. We want to go here with title. That one is equal to a string. And then also we want to go with price. This one will be optional, and we'll set it equal to a number. So now in the array, we can nicely store product one and product number 2. Now it looks like TypeScript is complaining. Why? Well, because I forgot the square brackets. And at the very end, let me just showcase something interesting. Where if I go with products and then push, provide the object, set up a title here. In my case, I'm going to go with shoes. Even though price is optional, we still need to provide the correct type. So let's say if I don't provide anything, notice how TypeScript is not complaining. Effectively, this is optional, the price one. Now, if I do provide the price, it has to be a number. So if I go here with price and set it equal to a string, TypeScript will immediately complain. Yes, it's optional, but if I do decide to pass the value, the type needs to match whatever I have here in the type annotation. Beautiful. We have finally arrived at the functions in TypeScript, and I'm super excited to cover this topic for a few reasons. First, our examples are going to get more complex because we'll start tying together all of the concepts we covered previously. And also, once we start working with functions, we absolutely have to start using TypeScript, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So let's say I have a function of say hi. Why not? Let's set it up, say hi. For now, we're not going to pass any parameters, and as far as the functional logic, we'll just leave it empty. Now, say hi is looking for what? Well, probably some kind of name, correct? And in a function body, we can nicely log it. So the moment I type over here any parameter, in my case name, notice right away I'm getting these red squiggly lines. And this is what I'm talking about. At this point, we absolutely have to start using TypeScript. Otherwise, TypeScript won't compile our code. So if we hover over, we notice parameter name implicitly has any type. And essentially, TypeScript complains about it. So that's not allowed. Yes, by default, implicitly, it sets it up as any, but we need to fix it in order for TypeScript to compile our code. And at this point, essentially, we have 3 options. First, we could set type any ourselves. That's definitely one option. Also, and you know what? Let me just comment this one out. Also, we can navigate to tsconfig, and we can actually change the configuration, something I'm going to showcase in a second. Or the best scenario is for us to actually set this one up with a proper type annotation. So in this case, I'm looking for a string, most likely. So I'm going to say type. Okay, so let's try it out here with any. What's the issue here? Well, just like we covered before, any is anything. So everything that we can do in JavaScript pretty much will be able to do with the name here. And actually, I believe in 2 videos, I'll showcase the any gotcha that we need to be aware of. So this is not going to be approach. Yes, technically you can do it, but I mean, at this point, we kind of lose the benefits of TypeScript. Now, second option, we can navigate over here to the package.json, or I'm sorry, why am I going to package.json? We're going to tsconfig. And notice over here, this strict rule, technically, we can change it around. I can set it equal to false. And at that point, TypeScript won't complain about the fact that parameter by default is left as any. So you can definitely try it out. You can set it equal to false and you'll see that actually code works. Everything's fine. But in my case, I'm going to skip that. I'm just letting you know that technically this is an option. So we have finally arrived at the option we're going to use, and that is setting name explicitly to the type we're going to use. And just like before, we simply want to go with colon and we want to come up with the type. In my case, that is going to be string. And again, I know you're probably sick of this method, but I'm just going to use 2 uppercase. Essentially, I want to set up over here a log. Then I'm going to go with template string and we're going to go with hello there over here. And now I'm going to access the name. So the moment here we set up a proper type, let's say string, number, or whatever, 2 things are going to happen. First, when we call this function, every time we'll pass in a wrong type, TypeScript is going to yell at us. And second, within this function body, we can only perform functionality that is allowed on this specific type. So in here, yes, let's go to uppercase, let's invoke it, and let's try invoking say hi. And let's say I'm going to pass in John, and also in the next line, I'm going to pass in 3. So if everything is correct, we should get an error over here. We can nicely see that we can only grab the string methods inside of the function body. And if we inspect the console, we should see John over there. And lastly, if we try to pass more parameters than what we have specified, we'll also get an error and TypeScript won't compile our code. And with this in place, now we can move on to the next topic. Okay, and up next, let's talk about function returns. So first I'm going to create a function and I'm going to call this calculate discount. Discount over here. It's going to be looking for price. And I know that the type is going to be number. For now, inside of the function body, I simply want to go with the return and we're going to go with price. Again, since this is a number, once I press dot, notice I'm only getting the methods that are associated with the type number. And if you're sick of me hearing this, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep on repeating that because, again, I find this truly helpful. And let's say I'm going to multiply this by 0.9. So I'm going to go over here, 0.9, okay, good. And then I'm going to set up a variable. So I'm going to go with const final price. And I'm going to set it equal to calculate discount. I'm going to pass in 200. And I don't think I need to log the value. I don't think it's necessary. So if I hover over the final price, I can see that it's a number. Now, why is that a case? Because, again, TypeScript is inferring the type. TypeScript sees, okay, so this is a number here. We're returning a number multiplied by something. So whenever we hover over this calculate discount, we can nicely see another set of colon and a number over there. And I know that it might look a little funky over here, but yes, essentially the syntax is following. In order for us to set up the type for the function return, we need to go after parentheses, we need to set up the colon, and then we explicitly need to go with the type. Now, again, you can make a case, well, why do we need to set up type if TypeScript is already inferring the type? Well, for essentially 2 reasons. First of all, if I set up over here a number type explicitly, as I'm working in this function, if for some reason I forget to set up the return, or if I set up a return which doesn't match what TypeScript is expecting, well, I'm going to get an error. So it's going to be super helpful. Let's imagine this. I have some kind of has discount variable over here. And I'm going to just set up has discount. So essentially some kind of condition. And in here, instead of returning a number, I'm going to go with discount and applied. Notice right away, TypeScript is complaining. Type string is not assignable to type number. As we're working in the function, TypeScript is kind of watching over us. And if I return something that I'm not expecting, well, essentially TypeScript just starts yelling at me. Because again, yeah, it's trying to infer the type. But once I remove my logic, well, essentially now it could be a string or it could be also a number, correct? So now if we hover over this, notice we either have a number or it's going to be discount applied. And the same goes over here. Either it returns a number or discount applied. So even though it's technically optional, it's a good practice to set up the return types explicitly, since it helps us tremendously as we're setting up the functionality. So now let me comment this one out, and I'm just going to go with price, like so. And with this in place, now we can move on to the next topic. And next, I just want to show you why we want to be careful with type any. But this is one of those videos where you don't have to type along if you're not interested. Essentially, you can just sit back and relax. So let's imagine I have a function and the name is add3. So it's looking for one parameter, which is a number. And don't ask me why, but I'm just going to set it equal to any. So I'm not sure what would be the use case, but let's just go with it. Then inside of the function body, I'm going to create another number. In this case, type will be a number. So I'm going to be explicit. And then as far as the return, let's just go with the return number plus another number. Why not? And then let's set up two variables. One is going to be result, and then we'll also set up some value. So let's try it out. I'm going to go over here with result. That one is equal to add3. So as far as the value, you know what? Let me just pass in 3. So 3 plus 3. And then also we want to set up some value. So that one will be equal to a result. So now, $1,000,000 question. And no, I'm not asking what is going to be the result. I'm more interested, well, what is going to be the type? So if we hover over some value, notice something interesting. How essentially it's any. And what that means, well, go with some value and my method. And technically it's going to be valid as I'm typing the code, but hopefully it's clear that it will lead to some errors since there is no method, my method. And as you can see, everything starts with this innocent any. And notice how it trickles down. So we pass number, that is type any. And even though this is a number, and technically this is a math operation, TypeScript should infer that we're returning a number. However, if we hover over, notice over here, we're expecting any, we are returning any. So result is any, then some value is any. And as I mentioned before, be careful when you introduce any, because it can slowly trickle down or spread like wildfire, whichever term you want to use. And next thing you know it, you're going to be unintentionally or intentionally running some methods or setting up some kind of functionality, which doesn't make sense. And at that point, you'll again need to start chasing those bugs at runtime, not as you're writing the application. So now if I navigate to the browser, notice over here, some value that my method is not a function. An error, which we can expect since there is no such method on some value. And with this in place, now we can work on our next challenge. Beautiful. And once we're familiar with the fundamentals, let's work on our next challenge. And you know what? I actually changed my mind. I will list out the steps for a few reasons. First, the challenges are getting more complex. And also, I want everyone to be on the same page. Let's say someone is not reading the README. We're utilizing the README. I still want them to kind of have an idea what I'm trying to build. So effectively, I want to create the array of names. And then I want to write a function that checks the name, whether it's in the array. So this function should take name as parameter, and it should return a Boolean, whether the name is in the array or not. And then we want to set up one or a few checks and essentially just test out some names. So let me go to my file. First, I want to come up with a value, and I'm going to say that it's going to be an array of strings. And let's just provide some random values. So I'm going to go here with John. Then I also want to go with Jane. Let's set up Jim. And also we'll place a Jill over there. I don't know why I set all of them starting with J. Must have been a bad day in the office or something like that. Then let's come up with our function. So in my case, I'm going to go with isName in list. And this function is going to be looking for a parameter. The type is going to be string. And I'll right away set up that I want to return from this function a Boolean. So whether the name is in the array or not. And therefore, I'm going to set up my type over here. And then right away, let's set up the return. I'm going to go with names. So that's the array. And I'm just going to use the includes method. And in here, I'll pass in the name. So I pass the string over here, and then I pass the same one into includes. And essentially, this is just going to return true or false. Then let me set up a variable name to check. Now, technically, I mean, we don't have to do it. We can just pass it in, but you know what? Just to make things more interesting, I'm going to go with name to check. In this case, you know what? I will rely on the fact that TypeScript will infer this type. So let me type over here Jane, and let me set up if and else. So I'm going to go with isName in a list, and I'm going to pass in name to check. If that's the case, I'll have one log. If not, I'll have something else. So now let's set up those logs. So in here, we're looking for a name to check, whatever it might be. So now let me access this as a variable. So name to check, and then let's say in the list. And now pretty much let me just take the same console log and add not in the list. Okay, good. And now let me save the file. Let me navigate to the browser. And if everything is correct, Jane is in the list. So if I'm going to set it up over here, a value of Peter, now it's going to say Peter is not on the list. And with this in place, we're done with the challenge. And we're ready to move on to our next topic. Up next, let's discuss optional and default parameters in functions. Essentially, how we set them up from the TypeScript perspective. I'm going to start by creating a function calculate price. It's going to look for two variables, price, which is going to be number. And for now, I'll set discount as a normal parameter. So I'm not going to set it as default or optional. So let me go with discount. Let me set it up as number. Then inside of the function body, I'm going to go with return. And we're going to look for price minus the discount. Okay, good. Makes sense. I mean, if we want, we can set up over here a number as a return as well. That's definitely an option. And then let's go with price after discount. And that one will be equal to calculate price. And I'm going to pass in some even numbers just so we don't need to log it. So essentially, I pass in 100 as a price, then 20 as a discount, and then the result should be 80. All right, but what if I want to make this one optional? What if sometimes I'm going to provide the value and sometimes, well, it's not going to be available? Well, the syntax is following. We want to go to the parameter and we need to add the question mark. But notice right away, TypeScript is complaining. And the reason for that is because possibly discount can be undefined. And in our case, we already have a math operation where we take the price and then we subtract the discount. But if this is undefined, I mean, it doesn't make sense. So the key thing to remember about optional parameters is that a function with optional parameters must work when they're not supplied. And as far as the fix, well, we just need to provide the fallback value. So if this is undefined, the discount one, well, then we'll have some kind of number value. And the way we do that, we just set up the OR operator. And in this case, I'm going to go with 0. That's how we can work with optional parameters in TypeScript. And while we're still on the topic, let's also discuss the default parameter. Now, for this one, I think I'm going to create another function. Why not? Let's just keep on practicing. This one is not going to be calculate the price, though. We're going to go with calculate score. We're going to pass in the initial score, which will be a number. And also, we're going to go with penalty points. And same deal. For now, we're just going to set it that it's actually a number. I mean, it will be a number, but we'll just set it as a default eventually. Now, as far as the return, again, same deal. We're going to set it equal to a number. And when it comes to logic, we want to go with the return initial score minus the penalty points. And once I have the function in place, now let me set up 2 variables. So we're looking for score after penalty. And I'll provide over here calculate score. And again, I'm going to go with some even values. So I'm going to go with 120. And now I want to set up another variable. Oh, in this case, I'm going to go with without penalty. And I'll just provide the first one. So that will be my initial score. And notice right away, TypeScript is going to complain. So here's the deal. If we set up a parameter and we don't provide it, or we provide one too many, well, then TypeScript will complain. So this is something to keep in mind. And how we can fix it? Well, we can either go back to this optional parameter, which we discussed in the previous video, or we provide some default for this one. So we make penalty points as a default parameter. And the way we do that, just like with JavaScript, we just add the equal sign over here and come up with the value. So in my case, it's going to be 0. So now, if it's provided, awesome. We're going to use the penalty points value. If not, well, then we'll just revert back to the 0 because that one is the default one. And here's the key difference. If we use optional parameter, we do need to set up this logic. If we have a default one, it's not the case. Then we'll just use whatever value is provided. Okay, and up next, let's discuss how we can work with REST parameter in TypeScript. And also, let me showcase one more time how smart the TypeScript is. Let's say we have a function and the name is going to be sum. Now, for now, I'm not going to pass any parameters. I'm not going to set up any return type. Simply want to have my function, and I'm just going to invoke it and show you what arguments I'm going to provide. So this one will be equal to result, and in here I just invoke the sum, and effectively in here I want to provide 2 arguments. So I want to provide a string and a list of numbers. So string is going to say, well, the total is, and then whatever numbers I provide, they're going to be added together, and that will be my sum. So in here, let me go with the string, and let's say total is, then we're going to go with the colon, and then we have a list of parameters. So this is where we'll need to implement the REST parameter. Otherwise, I mean, one case I might add 5 numbers. In the next instance, it might be only 3. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So it's not always going to be 1 or 2 numbers. It's going to be a list of numbers. So in this case, I'm going to go with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, TypeScript is complaining since we haven't set up those parameters over here. So let's start with a message. In this case, it's going to be a string. And now let's see how we can work with such a list. And essentially, the syntax is similar to JavaScript. The only difference is that we need to provide, well, what type of array it's going to be. So in JavaScript, we use this syntax, 3 dots. Then we come up with a name. In this case, I'm going to go with numbers over here. And this is the rest parameter. And essentially, JavaScript treats this as an array. So in here, we want to go with number because I need to let TypeScript know what kind of type it is, and then the array. Now, please keep in mind, if you have strings here as well, essentially, you just go with number, then use the type union, and essentially set up a string there as well. And now pretty much all of the arguments that are past the string are going to be collected in this numbers array. Now, I also right away want to set up what are we returning from this function. And essentially, it's going to be a string. Now, before we set up the logic, which we're going to do with reduce, I also want to showcase how smart TypeScript is. So I'm just going to create the doubled variable, and I'm going to set it equal to numbers. So that's my array. Then let's invoke map. Then we're going to go with num, and let's just return num times 2. And again, let me just log, I guess, here, just so we can see that the functionality works. But what I want to showcase, though, is this. Notice as we hover over, TypeScript immediately knows that it's a number. So let's say you have some kind of callback function that you pass into the map, into the reduce and all that. TypeScript is going to see what kind of type array it is if you have supplied those values. And it will immediately know that as we're iterating over, this is a number. Now you can explicitly provide the value. I mean, no one is stopping you to go here and say number, but in general, TypeScript is super helpful. And we also have right away this useful error where the type should be string as far as my return. But at the moment, well, I'm not returning anything. So let me set up that functionality as well. And this is the case where I will use the reduce, and then I'm just going to return the message, the total is, and then I'll sum up the values. So I'm going to go with let total is equal to numbers. Then let's provide reduce over here. I mean, we can call this accumulator and total or current, however you want to do it. In my case, I think I'm going to go with previous over here and the current one. And then as far as the logic side of the function, let's just return previous plus and then the current one. And the same deal. TypeScript knows that it's a number since I have array of numbers. Now, since I'm using reduce, I also want to provide the default value, which is going to be null. And then from this function, I want to return a string. So I'm going to set up the template literal. We'll provide the message, and we'll also provide the total over here. So now let me just see what the result is, I guess. So let me just log the result. And also we should see that doubled one in the console. So notice this functionality works over here, and the total is 15. And in the process, we covered two important things: how we can work with rest parameter, which essentially collects the list of values if we don't want to access them one by one, and also how smart TypeScript is. In the callback function, we don't need to explicitly say, well, what type it's going to be. TypeScript already knows. And up next, let's discuss what type we should return if we're not returning anything from the function. And a good old example is just having a console log. So let me go with function log message. As far as the parameter, we're looking for message, and that one will be equal to a string. And then in here, let's use our good old console log, and let's just log the message. Now I do want to invoke it, and I want to provide some kind of value. So in this case, I'm going to go with hello and TypeScript. And since we have nice suggestions, if we just hover over the log message, we can see that TypeScript inferred the return type as void. And void is a special type that represents the absence of a value. And when we use it as a function return type, void indicates that the function does not return a value. Now, $1,000,000 question, do you always have to set it up? I mean, it really depends on your approach, but it is super helpful, especially if you consider this. Once we add this void over here, even if I set up some kind of return, and I'm going to go with hello world, notice how TypeScript right away says, well, you cannot assign string to a void. So if we decide that this function is not going to return anything, and we set up the keyword, even if later on we mess up something and start returning some values from the function, TypeScript is going to stop us from doing that. And up next, let's discuss union types as function parameters and what the type guards are. Now, I did set up this topic as a challenge just so you can see firsthand the type of issues we will face. So here's the task. I want you to create a function called process input that accepts a parameter of union type. So it can either be a string or a number. And when it comes to functionality, if the input type is number, we simply want to multiply it and log it in the console. And if it's going to be a string, just use one of the methods. So in my case, since my favorite method is the uppercase one, most likely I'll use that one, but it really comes down to the preference. So I'm going to navigate to my tutorial and I want to come up with a function. So I'm going to go with process and then input. And I believe in one of the previous videos when we covered the rest parameter, I mentioned that you can still use the union type. I mean, it's not a big deal. And here I can go with input and then just say string or the number. However, once we set up the functionality, this is where we'll add additional logic, since now we have two potential values, correct? So first, let's go with process input and pass in 10. This should work. And also, let's pass in the hello. Now, what about the logic? If we simply log, we should be good to go. So if I type input, notice there are no issues. But now what if I want to multiply this? What if I want to say times 2? Notice immediately TypeScript is not happy. Why? Well, we have a type string and we're multiplying this by 2. Now, TypeScript doesn't know that in here we're passing in 10 and in here we have the hello. So we need to set up something called type guard, where before we do any functionality, we actually make sure that the type is correct. Essentially, if I want to run a string method, I want to make sure that it's a string. If I want to multiply, I want to make sure that it's a number. Again, the fancy name for that is type guard. Now, we will look at multiple type guards. The most straightforward one is just type of keyword. And then we look for specific value. So inside of the function, I do want to set up a check. So there's going to be a condition, and I'm going to go with type of. Then I'm looking for my parameter, and I'm going to say if it's equal to a number. And notice how immediately TypeScript was helpful and provided a bunch of options. If you didn't, let me go back. Notice these are the values that we can use. And in this case, we're looking for the number. If that's the case, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to log times 2 over here. Now, if it's not the case, TypeScript is also smart. It knows that, listen, if it's a number, we're going to do this functionality. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative, it's a string, correct? So in here, we simply can go with else. Then again, we're going to go with log input. And you know what? Just so people are not upset with me, I'm just going to go with 2 lowercase. Again, the official name for this one is type guard. and we use it to check the parameter at the runtime. And while we're still on a roll, let's also see how we can work with objects as parameters in our function. So I'm going to set up a new function. Let me call this employee. And in here, I'll pass in the object with the ID property. And as a side note, the second example, which we're going to cover, is going to use a little different syntax. So in here, essentially, I'm right away destructuring the ID. I'm saying, yeah, there's going to be an object with the ID property, and I right away want to access it. Now, as far as the TypeScript, same deal. Just like with regular objects, we want to set up this type annotation, and we want to be specific. Well, what are we going to be getting here? So is this a number, string, or whatever? And in this case, I'm going to set it equal to a number. As a side note, yes, in like, I believe 3 videos, we'll cover type aliases. So it's not going to be as clunky, because at the moment, I fully understand if you're looking at it and you're like, whoa. So I understand this part, but does that mean that every time I'll have object with like 10 properties, we'll have to set it up over here? No, there is a better solution, and it's coming up. And also, just like with parameters, we can also set up the return type as an object. How does that look like? Well, same deal. I just say colon, then I provide the curlies, and what are we returning from this function? I'm going to go with ID, which again is going to be a number, and also there's going to be is active in this object, and that one will be a Boolean. And again, we set up the curlies. So we have 2 sets of curlies over here, and we also have 2 sets over here, because we have one for return and one for functionality. And as far as the logic, I just want to return an object from this function, and I need to make sure I follow this pattern, correct? I need to make sure that I return a number and a Boolean. So in this case, I'll just right away grab whatever I have over here. And also, as far as the is active, I'm just going to do some basic logic. I'm going to say ID, and then I'm going to use the modulus operator. Essentially, if ID modulus 2 is equal to 0, then it's going to be true, which means essentially that it's an even number. If not, then it's going to be false. So now let's try it out. We're going to go with const first, set it equal to create employee, and then let's pass in our object. So in this case, it's going to be 1, then copy and paste. This will be equal to a second over here, and then we want to log both of these results. So let's look for first and second. Let me navigate to a console, and for some reason, it says false because, yep, I didn't change this one. This should be equal to 2. So now the first one is active is false, and then the second one is active is true. Again, we really don't care about the functionality. I mean, we can definitely hard code over here. Doesn't really matter. So hopefully it's clear. If we have an object, we nicely set up right away the annotation, at least with the current knowledge we have. Now, also we have alternative approach where we can give some kind of name to this object, and then we can just use it inside of the function body. Again, please keep in mind the general idea as far as TypeScript doesn't change, but I do want to make sure that we understand that we have multiple approaches. So let me call this alternative over here. Then we will go with function, create student in this case, and I know that I'm going to get the object, and I'm just going to give it a name of student. So this still will be an object, but I'll just access it with student.student. And same deal. I want to go with my annotation. I'll say that ID will be a number and name will be equal to a string over here. And then as far as the function body, I'm actually going to go with void. So we're not going to return anything from this function, and we're just going to log stuff. So let me scroll down a little bit. Let's set up the template literal. Welcome to the course, I guess. And let's access the student. where we go with student, and notice we right away get the suggestion which properties are on this object, since this is what we specified in our type annotation. And in this case, I want to go with name and then to uppercase. Also, please keep in mind that yes, we can the structure right here in a function body as well. That's totally an option. So now let me call it with the new student. So in this case, just to again showcase that we have multiple approaches, we want to go with student. We want to set it equal to an object. I'm going to go with 5 over here, and name is going to be Anna. And I'm just going to rely on Typescript to infer the type. And then we'll go with create student, pass in the new student, and if everything is correct, we should have the value in the console. And with this in place, we can move on to the next topic. Okay, before we move on and start working on our next challenge, let's also cover the access property check gotcha. And for this one, actually, we don't need to create too much code from the scratch. I'm just going to remove my first function from the previous video. I'll leave create student as it is, and I simply want to invoke it right below. And in this case, I will pass everything in line. So unlike previously, where we set up the object, now I'll provide all of these properties one by one. Let's start over here with ID. I'll set it equal to 1. As a side note, it's totally irrelevant what we pass in here. That's not the gotcha. The gotcha is following. If we add here extra property, what do you think is going to happen? Well, we have a type annotation for ID in string, correct? So, I mean, logic tells us that if we add here email and we set it equal to bobo@gmail.com, TypeScript is going to complain. And you're totally correct. Essentially, it says, hey, listen, you didn't specify that there's going to be an email while you're adding this to the object. So this is something we expect. However, notice this interesting behavior where I can go here with an email and essentially pass in some kind of value. And you know what? It's going to work. TypeScript is not going to complain. So yeah, this is this interesting behavior where when we pass in object properties in line, TypeScript expects to match this exactly. So if we'll add some extra properties, TypeScript will immediately complain, because in TypeScript's mind, we have a full control of what we're adding in line. However, if we're just referencing the object and there's an extra property, the only thing TypeScript cares about are the properties that are in the type notation. So if there's 120 extra properties, TypeScript is like, okay, do you have an ID and name? If yes, we're good to go. If not, then of course, there's still going to be an issue. Hopefully it's clear. Just remember this gotcha and you'll be good to go. All right. I think we're ready for our next challenge. And at least in my opinion, this one is going to be super interesting because we'll combine multiple things from the previous videos. So we want to create a process data function, which is going to accept 2 parameters. First one is going to be input parameter, which can be a string or a number. And second one will be a config object. And instead of that config object, we'll have the reverse property, which is a Boolean. So if we pass in a number, we just want to multiply the number with its own value, essentially input multiplied by the input. However, if the input is the string, our second option, and if the reverse is true, we want to reverse the string and set it uppercase. Now, if we provide a string, but the reverse is set to false, well, in that case, we'll simply set up the string to be uppercase and just return it. So let me navigate to my tutorial. I think I'll just remove all of this logic. And you know what? For starters, I want to set up a function. In here, I'm going to call this process data. I'm not going to set up any parameters yet. Same goes for functionality. And I simply want to log it in 3 places. Essentially invoke it and then log it. So in the first case, I'm going to pass in 10. And then I'll set up 2 more hellos. So these are going to be instances where we pass in the string. And now, as far as the process data, like I said, we have input over here, but we want to use the type union. So either it's going to be a string or it will be a number. So that will be our first parameter. Now the second one is the config one. If we pass this config, in there, there's going to be a reverse property. And as a side note, I actually forgot to do that. So first one is hello, and then we want to go with our config object. And I will set the reverse equals to true. So let's navigate to our parameters. And let's set up the second one. So I'm going to call this config. It's an object. And in there, I'll have the reverse property. So I'll set it equal to a Boolean. Now, here's the kicker. What if I pass in the number? Do I really care about that reverse one? And the answer is no. I only care about it if it's a string. Correct? Only then we'll check. But if it's a number, it doesn't really matter. And therefore, I can nicely set this as default reverse false. So I'm not going to have to do that additional check. Basically, once I pass in the number, I don't have to pass this additional config object. So in here, let's go with default one and set it equal to reverse and false. Now let's also set up what we're returning from this function. So either it's going to be a string or a number. And now when it comes to logic, well, we have 2 options, correct? So we can have a string or a number. So we do need to set up a type guard if we want to multiply it. I want to make sure that it's actually a number. So let's go with if, then type of, if the input is equal to a number, well, that's when we want to multiply and return. So let's go with return, then input times input. And it looks like I have a tiny typo over here. This should be return. And also we want to set up the else. And in here, we're going to go with the return. Then we'll check the config reverse. So by default, it's going to be false. So if it's true, then we want to set it to uppercase, split, reverse, and join. If not, well, then we'll simply return it with the uppercase. So let's set up over here a ternary operator. We're going to go with input, then to uppercase. Let's invoke that. Then we're going to split it. Then we'll call reverse on it over here. And then lastly, let's use join method. Let's do this. And if it's false, which is the default one, we're going to go with input, then to uppercase, and we're going to invoke it. So now let me navigate to the browser and let's see. So I have 100, then I have straight up hello, just to uppercase, and then I have the reverse value. Again, in my opinion, the biggest gotcha is over here. You see, if you're not going to provide this default value over here, then pretty much every time you'll invoke this process data, it's also expecting this object over here. And if that's the functionality you want to go for, it's definitely an option. But in my opinion, it's super useful to add this default one. Because in that case, well, if it's a number, or if I don't want to actually reverse it, well, I simply don't provide that argument. At least that was my logic. And with this in place, we're done with the challenge, and we can move on to the next topic.